Sahara TV. My name is Rodolfo Konko. In South Africa last week, at the African Union Summit, politics and law came in conflict when a court ordered the detention of President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan. Joining us now is an international criminal justice lawyer with the Southern African Litigation Center, the organization that filed a lawsuit to detain al-Bashir. And her name is Angela Mudukuti. Angela, welcome to Sahara TV.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start from the beginning. Why do you think this lawsuit or the arrest and detention, in fact, the holding of accountable of President al-Bashir, why do you think it's necessary now?
I think it's very important because the ICC conducted independent investigations in 2000 that resulted in the 2009 and 2010 indictments. And the problem with the Darfur region is that the crimes continue to be perpetrated. UN statistics indicate that 300,000 people have died, and there's been no justice and accountability for this. And this simply cannot be allowed to stand.
Okay, so what process did your organization go through to file this lawsuit?
First, I should begin by explaining that we've been monitoring the situation for a while as it falls under our International Criminal Justice Program, where our mandate is to ensure that states adhere to their international and domestic law obligations. So in South Africa's case, the obligation to arrest Bashir. So when we found out that South Africa would be hosting the African Union Summit, we realized that there was a big chance that President Bashir would be invited and would subsequently come. And so we kept an eye on the situation and began by writing a letter in May to the state and the relevant authorities indicating that we were concerned about the presence of President Bashir and reminding them of their obligations in terms of the law. Okay. But needless to say, President Bashir came, and we weren't certain he was coming until he arrived. We had heard rumors, and there was great speculation, but we didn't know he'd arrived until Saturday at 10 p.m. when we filed our emergency papers before the court.
Now the process, what we know now is that ICC also contacted the South African Embassy in the Netherlands, and they said the same thing that you said, that we are telling you to arrest him, detain him when he comes to South Africa. But there's something that the South African government did. They issued in their gazette saying that all diplomats coming to the AU meeting, they will have immunity. What do you think about that? Is that a cover? Does that stop them from following or adhering to the requirements of the ICC?
No, it doesn't, because publishing something in a government gazette does not make it law. The only way you can make something law in this country is if it passes through both houses of parliament, and that immunity regulation never passed through parliament. So it cannot be regarded as law. And I mean, even if we did decide to say that this is law, it's unconstitutional and therefore invalid. So it's not a good cover, and immunity doesn't apply to President Bashir in this situation.
Now, so where is the lawsuit? What happens next? What is going on now in terms of he escaped from the country? Who is responsible? Have you been able to narrow it down to who are the ministers or who make that call? How did he escape, by the way?
Okay, so where we're at now is that the court issued the order. First of all, the first order was that he should not be allowed to leave the country, and the second order was that he should be detained and arrested. But the court didn't issue its reasons for that order, and we're expecting them later next week. So once we get the court's reasoning and judgment, we also need to wait for the state's response, because the court has asked the state to file submissions explaining exactly what you've just asked me. How did Bashir escape and who is responsible? So once we're in possession of those two documents, we'll determine the way forward.
Now, what does this say about the South African government commitment to human rights?
I think it's a very, very disturbing development, because it shows very little respect for the independence of the judiciary, very little respect for the rule of law and the Constitution. And I think it puts South Africa's government in a very bad light, and it's an issue that needs to be seriously addressed because it has repercussions. I mean, how do we expect the average citizen to respect the rule of law if the government itself does not?
Now, I must ask you about the alternative argument. A lot of people are making the argument that ICC, that they are not fair to African leaders, that they target Africans instead of making it fair across the board, across the world. You know, like Western leaders are not being asked to account for their actions. So what do you say to people who make that argument?
I don't think it's a valid argument for the following reasons. Most of the cases before the ICC that are from Africa are what we call self-referrals, where independent, autonomous African governments have approached the court and said, we are unable to deal with the situation, we are referring it to you. So we see Africans making use of a court that they were fundamentally involved in creating. Without the votes of the African nations, the ICC would not have been created. So I think that's the first important aspect to remember, and also that there are victims of these crimes. These crimes have not been, they're not a figment of someone's imagination. There is evidence, there are witnesses, and there are victims. And so justice needs to be done. I agree that the ICC would do well to expand the geography of its docket, but also it has jurisdictional limits. For example, the US is not a signatory, so the ICC has no jurisdiction. And then it also faces the second challenge at the United Nations Security Council level, where unfortunately we see politics at play there, where the big powers either refer a situation or they don't. So those are two very valid criticisms against the court that they need to address, but I don't think that lessens the value of the current cases before the ICC, because there are victims in all of these cases, and there are crimes that have been committed.
Now, you said that the U.S. is not a signatory to the ICC, but also we know that within Africa there are movements now, people saying that Africa should leave. Most African countries, including the ANC, they are debating that. Do you think it's a good move?
I think it would be a very terrible move and very bad for international justice and for victims of egregious crimes, because when we look at the African continent, the SADC tribunal has been disbanded and in future may only have interstate jurisdiction. So individuals will not be able to approach the SADC tribunal. We look at the African court. There is now a protocol that is pushing for an African court with criminal jurisdiction, but with immunity for heads of state. And that in itself doesn't make any sense, because heads of states are the ones who perpetrate these crimes more often than not. And so there is a deficiency at the African level. And for us to withdraw from the Rome Statute would do more harm than good, because who is going to address these cases? Who's going to bring justice to the victims? We don't have structures in place, and most of our national courts are not strong enough. So
now,
we need to do two things. We need to strengthen national courts, and we need to support the ICC and critically engage with it. Because remember, the ICC is designed as a court of last resort. So only when states are unwilling or unable to handle an issue does it go to the court. So the ICC, its design was that national courts should handle their issues, but we don't see that, which is why we have an international criminal court.
Now, for those people who are pushing for Africa to withdraw, they're also pointing at the African courts that has been there but hasn't been operative. They're thinking that if Africa gets out of the ICC, Africa can handle its own problems. Do you think that is possible, that Africa can do that?
I think under the existing African court, which doesn't have criminal jurisdiction, there is potential, but under the new protocol, which would give that court criminal jurisdiction, it would also give heads of state immunity and senior government officials. Now, the next question is, anybody can be defined as a senior government official, so there would be immunity at that level, so there would be no trials. So I think the protocol, the current protocol that the AU is pushing to have members ratify would be devastating and would not be a good way to address the crimes perpetrated on the African continent. The African court, should it come to fruition with criminal jurisdiction, needs serious funding and a protocol that does not include immunity for heads of state.
So were you really thinking that it was possible to detain Bashir in South Africa based on your calculation when you filed the lawsuit?
Absolutely. I mean, we really did think it was possible, because the law is in our favor and on our side, and that's why the judges ruled in our favor. The law is very clear on this point, and so there was a great chance that he could have been arrested and detained. We are disappointed that politics and that the government responded in a way that is in contravention of the rule of law, but we had great hopes. We were very optimistic.
Now, looking at Africa as a whole, and of course he went to Nigeria and there were moves like this, but it also failed. Do you think he will ever be detained and called to account for what happened in Darfur and other places in Sudan?
I would hope so. I think it's very important for Darfur and Sudan as a region to move forward, and for true peace and stability, there must be justice and accountability. And so it is my hope that he will one day be held accountable. And let's also remember that just because he is transferred to the ICC does not mean he will be found guilty. It's a court. They can only convict based on evidence. We see President Uhuru Kenyatta, there was insufficient evidence to proceed. He is a free man. So it's not to say that just because he ends up at the ICC, he will be found guilty and arrested. It's to say that we need him to answer to the charges, which I think is important, and I think that's fair.
One last question. People say that these cases come up and there are issues like this, but the ICC, they don't do enough to protect witnesses, especially when you mentioned the case in Kenya. How do you think that you can go forward? Because one thing is to charge someone and actually take him to court, but if you can't get the witnesses to come to court and testify, you may not have any chance of getting any verdict. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. I think there's a serious problem with witness protection, and the ICC needs to work to address that. I cannot speak on their behalf. I'm not with the ICC, but it is something that I think they've learned a lot of lessons from the Kenya case, because, as you say, without testimony and witnesses, you can't move a case forward. So I'm hoping that there'll be new measures put in place for them to adequately protect their witnesses.
All right. Angela, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay. That's Angela Mudukuti, who is a lawyer with the Southern Africa Litigation Center. When we come back, we are going to continue our programs. We have a lot of programs for you today, interviews with newsmakers across Africa, so stay tuned.